Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to another module in the Lunch and Learn series, in the Executive series. I welcome you warmly before our weekend, and we're going to look at the topic of organisational structures today. So that'll be our main topic. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So could I ask people, please, if you could just go to the question box there and just type in clear. That lets me know that I'm being heard, and that's a good thing. So that would be great if you could do that. That would help me know that I'm coming across loud and clear, because sometimes these things don't always work out as we'd like. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, John. Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Martha. All right, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is wonderful. So warm welcome to everybody. And the normal process, of course, during this session is if you've got questions, comments, observations, then where you've just typed in clear, just type in your question, comment, or observation. I'm the only one that sees it. So the whole idea is as soon as I see it, I respond to it. So the whole idea is that we can keep this as interactive as possible. So that way we can exchange ideas on the way through and not have that awkward 10-minute pause while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions or comments, which is wonderful. Okay, now, as I said, we're going to be talking about options for organisational structuring. Now, bearing in mind, of course, some of you may not be in a position where you can do much about this, that the structure is what it is, but I guess when you do get into a position where you can actually think about how you might restructure your human resources to maximise your efficiency and effectiveness, some of these ideas might be very helpful. So I guess in that sense it should be thought-provoking and give you an opportunity to consider some of the constraints and opportunities in each structuring process. I should point out to you that there is no such thing as the perfect organisational structure. I mean, for many years, people thought the bureaucracy was the ideal structure, but of course, it's not, as we know, and there is no perfect structure. So every single structure I share with you, and I'm only going to share the key ones, will have their strengths and also their opportunities for growth as well. So you'll see there's weaknesses and strengths in each of these, and I'll obviously highlight these as we go through. Okay, so just a quick recap of where we are in the program. You will note on your screen right now, you can see that over on the left-hand side, we've got the 6 modules. Well, we're well and truly into it now, into Module 4. We looked at Module 1, which is strategically managing performance. Remember, we swapped 1 and 2 around. And we looked at influencing capabilities in Unit 2. And that's about improving your capacity to influence people using the influencing capabilities profile. And of course, last time we spoke, we talked about this concept of creating thinking space, which was really important. I think a lot of people all over the world now spend a lot of time completely absorbed in work to a point where they can't find the opportunity to think straight and to recalibrate, if you like. And I was suggesting there that there were some options for you to do that. That it is very important to find what Adam Fraser calls the third space. That is that window or that opportunity to sit down and recast and rethink about your goals and what you're trying to achieve. And if you don't create that, obviously what happens is that it doesn't happen. And you go from meeting to meeting, you go from activity to activity, and you don't get a chance to think clearly and carefully and strategically about what you're trying to achieve in the next activity, because it's one thing after the other. But unless you create that space, it doesn't happen. So that's what Module 3 was all about. And of course, today we're going to talk about organisational structuring. So 3 things that I'd like you to get out of today, which I hope that you will, is what are your options? So when you look at organisational structures, what are your actual options? How might you consider restructuring or confirming that the structure that you have is the right structure? So what are those options open to you? So I'll share with you the most conventional ones. I'll also share with you one that I put together and designed in one of my books, Performance Management for Agile Organisations, because I wanted to challenge some of the convention around the structures that were already out there. I want to talk about a concept called the ambidextrous organisation, which is a wonderful term, isn't it? And ambidextrous meaning we can use both hands, and I guess it really means a very flexible and manoeuvrable organisation. And I think that's very relevant where we are now in this new millennium. And I want to then finish up talking about some tools of agility so that we can talk about some of the ways and means of improving our capabilities so that we can be more agile in the workplace, because that's frankly what we need to be. The world is changing so rapidly that we really need to be completely on our toes, so to speak, and we need to have the structures in place that will allow us to flex and maneuver depending on the circumstances, whether it's a new product market, whether it's a new piece of legislation coming out of government, whether it's a new wave of activity, whatever it might be, we need to be flexible and maneuverable in those circumstances. And I want to share with you some of the ways and means that you might consider that. All right, so let's move on. So the first thing I want to share with you is what we might refer to as the functional model. Now, this model has been around, well, for about 100 years. It's the bureaucratic model. And I've just used a diagram here to simplify it. And the bureaucratic model, you'd have to say, has been quite successful, particularly in a stable environment that we've lived through in the 20th century. But perhaps it's not quite so applicable now. And how the bureaucratic model works, of course, is that we have functions that we call silos, if you like. So we've got operations and finance and marketing and human resources and a number of others, and they're all congregated together. So and usually what happens is that we've got a senior management team at the top whose job is to draw together all of the different silos. But the problem with the approach, as you could probably work out, is that the silos often don't talk to each other. And this is very real. And that the leaders at the top of these different silos or functions find that they are rewarded pretty much because they are functionally aligned. So given a choice between having an organisational view and having a functional view, the leaders of these functions will often take the functional view. And so what this creates is more discord in terms of communication cross-functionally. So I'm sure you're aware of that approach, and I'm sure you've seen many organisations set up that way, particularly large government departments and agencies are often set up as bureaucracies where you've got different silos of activity going on. And typically what you hear when you ring these places is that someone will tell you that, no, you've got to go and speak to X department, or this is not something we deal with in this area. Can I suggest that you ring X, or you go to the website and look at section such and such? So this can be problematic because obviously as a customer, what happens is that when we contact these organisations, we're not thinking in terms of silos, are we? We're really just thinking about wanting to get our, issue sorted, and then we're told that we're in the wrong department or in the wrong section. But of course, it's very effective in the sense that each silo can look after itself and can become reasonably self-sufficient. So, it has stood the test of time. It is very relevant at times during stability, where the external environment is not going to change much, so therefore there's no need to change much internally. But of course, now we're living in a world where the external market is changing significantly, so it's not so handy anymore. All right, so you've got you've got you've got the organisation in the middle, and you've got different the public around the outside. And what happens is that these organisations in the middle are pretty much siloed, but from the public's point of view, they just see them as one simple entity. So that can be problematic, of course. Now, another approach, which probably isn't as popular as the functional model, is the product model. Now, the product model is an interesting model in the sense that there are still silos. So we've still got these silos, but as you can see on your screen, these silos are now around products or services for that matter. And so it's kind of like a hybrid version of the functional model in the sense that the silos are still there. So it's still pretty much structured the same way. The only difference that instead of functions, we're actually using products. So as you can see on your screen as an example, you've got a digital products, a electrical products, a domestic products, a new product. So you've got these different products. And so the advantage of this approach is that each of these products can be self-contained. So within each product line, you'll have a human resources function, you'll have a financial function, an administrative function, and all of these, what these silos do is that they just work at specialising in producing a product or a service depending on the company. So building industries, for example, would be set up this way. Starbucks is a good example that has been set up partly this way. And you've got a number of other large agencies that are set up this way, and they can be quite effective in the sense that the product development goes on within a particular aspect of the organisation or the business. And of course, when you want to introduce a new product or a new service, because services are just as relevant for this model, but you want to introduce a new service, then you just add another silo. And so the organisation kind of develops horizontally rather than vertically. So I might have a new product, as it says there on the screen, and I introduce that, and I might take the resources from some of the other silos or bring in resources from outside. Now, the problem with this in practice is that the other silos, just like in the functional model, will be very jealous of their resources. And what will happen is that they'll hoard those resources. And if a senior manager wants to introduce a new product into this type of model, he or she may have trouble convincing the other product lines to give over their resources to allow another product line to develop, because of course they don't want to lose their people. So it can have constraints on development when the leaders are calling on resources from the other sections. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting model, and it's focused very much, at least, on the services and the products that the organisation is, well known for. And in that sense, it's theoretically, at least, the products and the services are more applicable to what the public wants, because they're pretty much fashioned around product lines. So that's another approach. And of course, as I said, it's not anywhere near as popular as the functional model, as we know, but in some industries it can be quite relevant. Another industry where it would be very relevant is in professional services. So, for example, a law firm or an accounting firm. So if you take a law firm, you may have different sections or units within the firm that specialise in particular areas, so that if you have a specific legal concern, you would be ushered to a particular department that looks after that specific service. And therefore you'd have the lawyers who would be very much specialists in that particular area. You might hope that some of those lawyers might refer business to other sections as well if somebody comes to that lawyer who doesn't specialise in that area. So that's an interesting model. Another model that it gained a lot of interest in currency at the end of the last century. So over the last 20 years, we have seen this model develop, and that's what we call the matrix model. Now, the matrix model is a hybrid version of both the functional and product models. So you can actually see there on your screen, you have, first of all, the different functions. So you've got operations, you've got finance, you've got marketing, you've got human resources. So they are in place, but you've also got, as we saw in the product model, we've got digital products, electrical products, domestic products, new products. So we've got two kind of streams, if you like, running through the business. Now, the matrix model is trying, of course, to gain the best of both worlds of the two models that I just showed you. So what that means is that somebody in operations, for example, will need to, of course, they might be part of the operations team, so they functionally are aligned with operations, but they will have contact with people in each of those different product lines. And what would happen in each of those product lines is you'd have a project manager or a supervisor or a manager who would overlay and oversee those products. So, for example, if there was a lack of communication going on between the functional areas, it would be up to, for example, the digital products manager to go and sort that out. So he or she would traverse across those different functional silos to try and make sense of what it is that they want to solve. Now, the big weakness of this matrix model is the fact that everybody who is working in this particular organisational model has two bosses. That is, they have a boss who happens to be a functional boss because they belong to a function, but they also have another boss who is a project boss, or in many cases they've got several project bosses. So what it does, unfortunately, it pits the employee against a couple of different managers. So what that means is it's often the employee, it's often the manager who yells the loudest or is the most persuasive or influential, and what we do is we will do what they want, and it may not necessarily be in the best interests of that particular product or the function that we're involved in. So it can be confusing in terms of lines of communication, but generally speaking, it can work very well if there are good lines of communication and if there are leaders who are good leaders who don't abuse those lines of communication as well. So that's a kind of a hybrid version of the product model and the functional model. And again, it still has its weaknesses, but and of course we can see this quite a lot. We see this in government agencies around the world, in many complex organisations where there are a number of significant projects operating. You will find a matrix model very much in play. And so it's really, and it can work extremely well, but it does have its downfalls in terms of communication, as I mentioned before. I have a view that people are tribal, and at the end of the day, people will congregate towards different tribes. And so, you put a group of people together anywhere on a desert island or anywhere, what will happen is cliques will develop, tribes will develop. So the question is not, do we have tribes? And of course, a lot of managers try and break down tribes. That's not the question. The question really is, are the tribes actually working effectively and efficiently in the interests of the organisation? That's the real question. So in other words, we should accept the fact that people will join tribes. The question we've got to ask is, are those tribes actually working for us as an organisation? So that's another model that you may be interested in. There's three models, and you may find that your organisation is set up as a matrix model as well. Now, I want to share with you my model now that comes, as I said, from my book, performance management for agile organisations. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that this is the be-all and end-all. It does have its weaknesses like the other three models, but I'm trying to address a couple of core problems with the other three models. The most important core problem with the other three models is that it's hierarchical. So in other words, what I mean by that is that you have to go up a chain of command in order to get direction or, to get permission to do something. And I have a problem with that because in a fast-changing world where quick decisions have to be made, often we don't have the time or the inclination even to check upline. And we've just got to make a decision on the spot, and that in itself slows down decision-making significantly when we've got a hierarchy. So the first thing you can see from my customer-centered model or customer-centric model is that you can see that it's a series of concentric circles. So in other words, what it's basically saying at the outset is that there is no hierarchy. We just have a series of concentric circles, and each of those concentric circles have some function or something involved with it. So you can see the first thing that I've done here is that I have actually included the customer at the center of the organization. What I find interesting is that on the other three models, there is no discussion or, there's no recognition of the customer. And what's fascinating is that's the whole reason we're in existence. The only reason that you're here in this webinar is because somebody's buying product from you, or, that some people out in the community need your assistance. And yet in our hierarchy or in our organizational charts, we very rarely see the customer even mentioned, which I find quite ironic. So the first thing I thought we should do is put the customer at the center of all of our actions. So theoretically, everything we say, think, and do should, in fact, have the customer in mind. That's what a healthy customer-focused organization does. Everything we think, say, and do has the customer in mind. Well, of course, in reality, that doesn't happen. But the first thing we probably should do is acknowledge that there are customers and put them at the center of the organization. And then the next concentric circle, or the next circle that's around that, is the frontline staff. So these are the people who deal directly with customers. So we have salespeople, we have customer service representatives, a whole bunch of people around that who basically their role is to deal with customers. So we put them in next. Now, one thing I should say before we move on any further is you'll notice there's some dotted lines over here. Now, these dotted lines represent functional responsibilities. So in other words, in this area here, this person might be frontline in sales. These people here might be frontline in customer service. So I'm acknowledging the fact that having a functional distinction in an organizational chart is probably not a bad thing. So, but the key thing I want to mention here is that you'll notice that they're dotted lines. So being dotted lines means that they shouldn't dominate all decision making. But we still should recognize that various departments are, can be configured in this model. The next circle, outer circle, is operations. Now, these are the people who basically create the product or the service in the back room, so to speak. So these are the people who actually might be working in a manufacturing aspect of the business. These are people who might be processing orders in a service-based organisation. And so these people, of course, are one step removed from the customers. And again, you can see that there are departments there as well. So obviously you'd have as many departments as there are in your organisation. But you'll notice that where this is quite a unique model is that we have two layers, outer layers, that aren't recognised in the other three models. So we have a project layer, which essentially means that, and it's a view that I hold, that everybody has a responsibility to be involved in the organisation in some way, shape or form. So apart from their functional roles. So for example, there should be a number of project teams set up where people can involve themselves in that. Now, Google are famous for this. They'll give people time off, I think on a Friday, where they can work with and through other people on anything they want to, develop new products or new services or whatever. Other organisations are moving in that direction as well. So these are project teams. Now, you might say, well, what are these project teams going to be made of? What possible projects could there be? You can see on the right-hand side on your screen, I've listed a number of different organisational concerns that may benefit from having a project team attached to it. So you've got an workplace organisational culture improvement team. So this might be a team of a cross-section of people who get together to talk about the organisational culture. We have a rewards and recognition or rewards and incentive team. And this team looks at how we might reward people beyond remuneration. We have an innovation and continuous improvement team, and this might be a team that will scrutinise ideas and thoughts and come up with suggestions about how we might improve our organisation. Most organisations now around the world have a safety and well-being team. Well-being is a relatively new phenomenon in terms of organisational structuring, but a safety committee, certainly in this country, in Australia, it is legally binding that we have a safety committee in every organisation who scrutinises and makes sure that the organisation is safe. But of course, that's another committee that's already been set up. We have a recruitment and selection committee. Now, when turnover occurs, and all organisations have some turnover, we do. We need to recruit. So the question is, how do we do that? And how do we coordinate the recruitment? And perhaps we can have a project team that looks after the recruitment. What are the policies and procedures that we need? What are some of the ways we might go about finding potential new people for our organisation? And the final team, and I mean there are many, many others, these are just examples, just to give you an idea of what would go in that concentric strata. We have a product or a service development team, and this would be a cross-section of people who would come together to talk about how the products and the services could be improved in the organisation and what we could do. So it's pretty closely aligned to the innovation and continuous improvement team. And of course, you can have as many teams as you want, but the argument is in this organisational structure is that every single person in the organisation has basically two hats. They have their hat in terms of what they're there to do, and that's depicted in the structure. But the other hat they have is that they're expected to be involved in one of these project teams or other project teams. So they're expected to be involved in those processes. And, it's what is often referred to as organisational citizenship. So in other words, by being part of the team, part of the organisation, you're expected also to be a citizen of the organisation in terms of being able to add value beyond your current job. So there's a thought. It's quite a different departure, of course, from the functional product or matrix models, but you might want to think about how it might relate to your workplace as such. So it can be quite interesting. Okay. So any questions, comments, observations, please type them in. I'm happy to talk about those. I've just got a question coming in now about the final layer, the strategic layer. Yes, thank you. I was going to move on. The strategic layer is actually the layer of management. So the people that reside in the strategic layer are the senior managers. And you'll notice they're the furthest apart from the customer, but they have an overview about all operations. But not only do they have an overview of all operations, they're also looking after the projects as well. So they're sponsoring those projects and making sure that people meet and that ideas are being percolated and generated and evaluated. And so their job is first and foremost to be an organisational leader, and secondly, perhaps then, to be looking at their functional role. So the managers are very much, you'll notice that there are no dotted lines. There are no dotted lines because these managers are expected to first and foremost be an organisational leader before anything else. And you'll notice that there's no dotted lines in the projects either because they're expected. Projects, of course, transcend all of these various functions. So you have, perhaps somebody from the product team, somebody from the administration, somebody from marketing, somebody from HR. So all of these people would be part of a project team that I just talked about. So thanks for the question. Thanks, Les. Okay, so moving on. Now, I did talk about the concept of the ambidextrous organisation at the start, at the outset, and I want to continue that because it's a very interesting concept. It was a very famous article written in the Harvard Business Review many years ago entitled just that, the ambidextrous organisation. And basically the argument in this Harvard Review article was that organisations need to be ambidextrous. Now, what the authors meant by ambidextrous was that they need to be able to be, on the one hand, stable and rigid and efficient. So basically they needed to have some degree of stability. I mean, you needed, obviously, in any organisation, you need systems and processes. You need ways and means of doing things. You need methodologies. Of course, you don't want the whole place to be completely systemised to a point where people freeze when something new comes up. But nevertheless, you expect some sort of organisation and structure. So, of course, most organisations don't suffer from that. They're perhaps, if anything, they're the other way. They're just too structured to a point where, particularly in the public sector, that don't allow any sort of innovation or flexibility, which is where the ambidexterity comes in. On the other hand, the organisation also needs to be flexible and manoeuvrable and adaptable and evolving and scalable. The organisation needs to be able to morph and change depending on the needs and the circumstances it faces. So in other words, the analogy of ambidexterity is an interesting one because when we think about ambidexterity, we often think about a person who can use their right hand or their left hand, say, for example, playing tennis. They can pick up a tennis racket in their right hand and play quite capably, and then they can swap and pick up the tennis racket in the left hand and play just as capably. And this is what organisations are expected to do is, yes, there is a place for structure, systemisation and efficiency, but on the other hand, we're also expecting organisations to be speedy, manoeuvrable and agile. And the argument that the authors make in their article is that an organisation can actually be both. But in order to be both, and it's certainly been my experience, in order to be both, you need very good leadership. You need very strong leadership. You need leadership that can be very decisive. And why you need that is that you need to be able to clarify in the minds of the people that work in these organisations the right time and the right place to be structured and the right time and right place to be agile. So in other words, people need to have a very clear idea of when it's appropriate to be one or the other. And that it requires very strong leadership. That requires leadership that people can depend on. Because if there's any ambiguity at all, it's likely that people will default to the structured, rigid approach. Why? It's safer. It's less chance of people making mistakes. And this is what occurs often when organisations try to become ambidextrous, is they're trying very, very hard to be flexible, but when it comes to the crunch to be flexible, people will default back to the old hierarchical system. So you can see that it can be quite a juggling act and requires extremely good leadership. But nevertheless, it's a good aspiration for organisations to be in, because let's face it, organisations have to be structured in some way, shape or form, because you just can't have people just not structured in any way. But on the other hand, people have to be flexible and manoeuvrable enough to take advantage of the circumstances that are in front of them. And so you need both hands working together, and hence the ambidextrous concept of the organisation. So that's something you might like to have a think about, and it's quite an interesting model, and it's an interesting way of looking at things. So it is possible, and some organisations have been quite successful at being able to produce that. I'm thinking, for example, of organisations like IKEA, who have been able to be quite innovative, but on the same level, they're quite systemised and so forth. Now, this is a very busy slide, of course, that you're seeing now, and I guess what I'm really wanting to highlight here is that there is a transition that we're going through at the moment between what's in the middle column there, which is the hierarchical value, and the new organisational form value. So what we're actually seeing right now is this enormous pressure for organisations to pretty much be on the right-hand side of the model in front of you. Very much to be emergent and decentralised, to be reasonably small and agile, to be impermanent, relationship-based, and so forth. So there is very much a strong push to be over there. But of course, historically, and I say historically, we're talking about a century of development here, that people have been socialised into being hierarchical. So in other words, to be top-down, to be concentrated, to be large, to be durable with clearly set and defined responsibilities, to be specialised and clear. So there is a conflict, obviously, between the middle column here and the column on the right-hand side. Now, what an ambidextrous organisation tries to do is to actually be able to take on and embrace both sets of values. Easier said than done. And because one, if you just threw out all the hierarchical concepts that are in the middle there and just went straight to the right-hand side, you may have an organisation in chaos, because there needs to be some control, there needs to be some monitoring, there needs to be some flexibility, some specialisation, there needs to be some rules, and there needs to be some efficiency. And without those kinds of concepts, you're going to find that it's probably pretty much a very difficult organisation with no really clear mandate of what to do. But why I'm showing you this model in front of you is that the enormous change or focus on moving from the left to the right is, in fact, it's diametrically opposite, which makes it even more interesting. So that in itself does present many, many challenges. And I would say to you as a senior leader, the critically important thing for you to do is to communicate and let people know when it's the time to be, one or the other. And when do you do this? In team meetings. And what you do is you use critical incidents, so examples of things that have occurred lately where you can use it as an example, not to point the finger of blame, but rather to talk about it as an example of whether we should be hierarchical or whether we should be on the right-hand side, and to actually run through some of these things. So using real-life examples is, in fact, a good opportunity to learn, and to help people to come to terms with these conflicting value sets. All right, so if you've got any questions or comments, please, over on the right-hand side, you know what to do. Now, in my book, Performance Management for Agile Organisations, one of the models that I have in there is an organisational model around organisational agility. And it seems to me that we use this term agile quite a lot, but I don't think anyone's really made any great effort to explain or at least define what we mean by agile. So I thought I'll put myself out there and I put together this model just to demonstrate what we mean by agility. So what I'll do is I'll run through these 8 dimensions, if you like, of agility, or 7, I should say, 7 dimensions of agility. Now, starting at the top and going clockwise, let's start with innovation. Now, all organisations should be in the business of innovation. Now, the definition of innovation is to design new ways of looking at things and doing things. So we want to challenge people to come up with new and better and faster and easier ways of being able to deal with things. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that because they think that it's their manager's responsibility to do that. So we want agility should be measured in terms of the degree to which an organisation can be innovative, can bring in new systems and processes and look at the ways and means of doing things. Very important. But moving around going clockwise, we also want processing speed. What we should be trying to do in all of our organisations is to increase our ability to process. Now, let's face it, when a customer or a client contacts you, they have a particular need, and that need normally has to be processed through several hands. And what happens is it's the speed and the accuracy, if you like, it's the speed of that processing that becomes the critically important point. So we need to be able to scrutinise our systems, our procedures and processes to ask ourselves a very important question: is this the best system, process or procedure to be used in these circumstances when we are dealing with the concerns of our stakeholders? So that has to be a measure of agility. And of course, a lot of people get wedded to their own processes and say, well, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've all heard that. And so people defend these systems and processes, and by doing that, they fail to look at different ways of doing things. So that becomes problematic. Going around the circle now, we need to have a speed in recovering from mistakes. All of us individually make mistakes. And therefore, by definition, all organisations make mistakes because they're really just a collection of people. So because we all make mistakes in organisations, it's not that we can reduce, well, we want to reduce our mistakes, of course, but it is impossible for an organisation not to make a mistake, just as it's impossible for a human being not to make a mistake. So that's a realisation we should accept. So the real question then is, how do we recover from our mistakes quickly? So recovery speed is critically important. And so for an organisation to be successful, they need to be able to recover quickly from their mistakes. Let me give you a very simple example. You go along to a restaurant and you order a meal, and the meal that's brought out to you is incorrect. It's not the order that you took from the menu. And so the waiter takes the meal away, and within the space of 10 minutes comes back with a brand new meal, the meal that you ordered. Now, you're impressed. You're probably disappointed in the first place that they brought out the wrong meal, but the fact that they could respond to you quickly probably suggests that you might forgive them for making that initial mistake. And that's what happens. If people feel that their mistake is being dealt with as a priority and with speed, they're often quite forgiving because people understand that mistakes do get made. The next one in the list is the continuous improvement. We want to be continually improving the way we do things. Now, you might say, well, what's the difference between continuous improvement and innovation? Well, continuous improvement is about improving on what we've already got, whereas innovation is coming up with a completely new approach. And both of those things are relevant now, and they're relevant because some things just need to be improved and some things need to be thrown out and replaced by others. So innovation and continuous improvement go hand in hand. So I've separated them on the model because both of them can be measures of whether an organisation is actually agile or not. The next one on the model is customer responsiveness. Now, we want people to be responsive to customers because at the end of the day, customers are fickle. Customers have got choice. Customers can leave us very quickly. Customer loyalty is a thing of the past. So customers have options. And because they have options, we've got to look after them. And of course, our responsiveness to them is critical. Our responsiveness can be anything from how quickly we deal with them, to whether or not we've dealt with them accurately, to whether or not we're listening to their feedback around products and services that we produce and how we might incorporate some of that feedback into our product and service delivery. So being responsive to the customer has to be profoundly important in any organisation. Whether it's a commercial organisation, a public sector government organisation, or a not-for-profit, customer responsiveness is critically important. The next area of importance is the problem solving. So we're all in the business of solving problems of our customers. And so we need to be good at solving problems. So that becomes another dimension that needs to be considered. How do we solve problems quickly and effectively in the right way at the right time with the right resources? And finally, and I would suggest that number 7, which is changing direction, is actually a culmination of all of the other things. Because if you think about it, everything that's in that model is actually a process of actually changing direction in one shape or form. So changing direction becomes critically important. So this model here is used to be able to evaluate your own agility. So if you think about your own organisation, how do you stack up on innovation, processing? How do you stack up on recovery, on continuous improvement, on customer responsiveness? How do you stack up on problem solving and changing direction? So it's a way of being able to look at your organisation and say, we need to have 7 balls in the air at once. And in order to have 7 balls in the air at once, you may need to make some changes and to do some things that might be effective for that organisation. All right. So the concept that I just want to touch on now, if I can, that should come up on your screen very soon. I think it's there now. Yep, there it is. So the concept I just want to talk about is the concept of industrial and organisational. In industrial and organisational psychology, organisational citizenship is a person's voluntary commitment within an organisation that is not part of his or her contractual tasks. So what that means is that people, as I said earlier in my customer-centric model, is that people should be wearing 2 hats. They should, of course, be wearing their functional organisational hat, which is pretty much what's on their job description. But the other hat is their organisational citizenship hat. So how about we draw on people's talents and abilities by implementing an organisational citizenship process where everybody becomes part of a project team. And I think that can become a very relevant source of inspiration for organisations. Okay. So we're coming towards the end of our session now. So if you've got any questions, now's the time to type them in. But I just want to do a little bit of a summary here that might sort of encapsulate some of the messages that have come out of our module today, and perhaps give you some food for thought around some of the things that you might be able to do when you go back to your organisation and look at your structures. I think the first important point is that anyone in an executive role, and I'm assuming that you may well be in this role or at least on the way to being in this role, you're actually wearing two hats. You have a functional hat. You're usually in charge of either a project or a function, and you're expected to make sure that that project or function is carried out effectively. So clearly you've got that hat to wear. But I'd also challenge you that you wear another hat, and that is an organisational development hat. So this is a hat that's involved with the total organisation. So you are the custodian of the total organisation. So often when you come and meet with your colleagues or your senior management, or what they often call the ELT meetings, the executive leadership team meetings, often there's a tension in the room between the parochial issues that affect each department versus the overall good of the organisation. And those two hats are not easy to reconcile, but nevertheless they're there. We should also have agendas. On our agendas, we should also have cross-functional issues. So instead of us just having a mindless reporting process where each person around the table explains their work in progress, it might well be a good idea for them to do that, but to shorten it and then have a conversation about some of the things that are affecting everybody around the table. So these could be critical incidents, they could be a crisis, that's something that's occurred, it could be a new product line. There's a whole range of possibilities of what it might be. So the other thing that I often find is useful is to rotate the executive and actually get executives to actually take on other roles. So for example, the executive in the engineering department, assuming there is one, takes on the role of the marketing executive for a month, and the marketing executive takes on the role of the engineering executive. Now, obviously they don't know much about their particular functional areas, but they do know about leadership, and of course they can always communicate with each other as a result. So we can actually rotate the senior team to give them a sense of how others operate in the team, what some of the constraints are, what some of the opportunities are, and to sensitise them to that hat that I mentioned before, which is the organisational hat. We should be having more cross-functional meetings, and I suggest to you that you should be looking at having meetings between various functions, particularly when you want to talk about communication. We should be using surveys to find out what people think. And as I mentioned earlier, people are generally speaking tribal, which means that basically they congregate in tribes. And our question really is, are the tribes actually working for us or against us? That's the key question, rather than whether there are tribes. So folks, that's pretty much it for today. So I've got a little bit of homework for you as usual. And this is a little bit of thinking homework more than doing homework, I think, but nevertheless, it's important, I think, for this topic. And your homework is, I would like you to consider your organisational structures. All right, so I want you to spend some time thinking about how your organisation is actually structured. And I'd like you to have a think about answering this question, because I think it's a very important question as a senior leader. And the question is this. The question is, how can you make your structure more efficient and effective? So what can you do? So you may not be, in charge of the total organisation, but I'm sure you've got some aspect of the organisation. So what could you do starting Monday to actually improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the organisational structure? Now, if you're stuck with that, what about having a meeting on Monday or Tuesday next week and asking the team that question? What about if we start to explore ways and means of actually how we can improve our organisational structures? So guys, that's the challenge for you for next time we meet. And I'd like, I'm keen to hear what you come up with. And by all means let me know that. So the next time we meet, we will be looking at the option of conflict, negotiation and conflict. Now, I have actually got a diagnostic that I'm going to get you to complete, and that one won't be electronic. It will be a paper version. So what I'm going to do is I'll be sending you out an email, not this afternoon, but probably tomorrow on Saturday. So if you check your emails tomorrow, you'll get it. But if you don't, you'll get it. So certainly it'll be in your inbox by Monday. And in that will be a survey for you to complete about yourself and how you like to deal with conflict. And I'd like you to finish it. And so that what we'll do when we get together for Unit 5 in a fortnight is we'll actually debrief on that survey. All right. So that's another bit of homework for you that I'd like you to complete. Which is pretty much it, guys. So I'm going to say goodbye. I wish you a great weekend. Thank you for your opportunity of working with you, and goodbye.